How Rex Beisel built the fighter the Navy tried to ban/February 1943. The U.S. Navy grounded this fighter. 6 months later, it was untouchable. Guadalcanal, February 1943. A grass airstrip cut into the jungle, still scarred from the fighting that had taken it from the Japanese only months before. A young Marine pilot climbs into the cockpit of an aircraft the United States Navy has just refused to put on its own aircraft carriers. He straps in behind an engine so large that the fuselage in front of him seems to disappear entirely. He cannot see the runway ahead of him. He can barely see past the cowling at all. To taxi, he has to swing the nose from side to side just to glimpse what is in front of him. His own service branch calls this aircraft dangerous. Some of his fellow pilots call it a widowmaker, and in a few minutes, he is going to take it up against the most feared fighter pilots in the Pacific, and something strange is about to happen. The Japanese are going to start being afraid of him instead. Pause on that, because this is not really a story about a dogfight. It is a story about an aircraft the people who built it almost never got to prove themselves right about, and a fix that did not come from the country that built it at all. This is the story of the Chance Vought F4U Corsair and the engineer who designed an aircraft too large, too fast, and too difficult for his own Navy to trust. It begins in the design offices of the Chance Vought Aircraft Company in Connecticut, with a chief engineer named Rex Beisel. Beisel was born in the early 1890s in the American Pacific Northwest, and unlike some of the great self-taught engineers of his era, he had actually trained formally, studying engineering before joining the small, still experimental world of naval aviation in its earliest years. He worked first for the government's own naval aircraft factory, then for Curtiss, before Chance Vought brought him on as chief engineer. By the time the Corsair began, he had already spent more than a decade quietly designing naval aircraft that almost nobody outside the Navy itself had ever heard of, building a reputation as a careful, exacting engineer who understood exactly what a carrier deck demanded of a machine in a way that pilots flying land-based fighters never had to think about at all. A carrier deck is not a runway. It is short, it moves, it pitches with the sea, and an aircraft that cannot be landed on it slowly and forgivingly is simply useless to the Navy, no matter how fast it flies. Every naval aircraft designer of that era lived inside that contradiction, the same tension between speed and gentleness that would eventually define the entire Corsair story before a single prototype had even been built. In 1938, the United States Navy issued a new specification that would test every part of Beisel's reputation. They wanted the fastest fighter that had ever operated from an aircraft carrier, faster than anything the Japanese or the British or anyone else had, and they wanted it built around the largest and most powerful aircraft engine in existence, the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial capable of producing close to 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what most fighters of the period carried into the sky. That engine was the problem before it was ever the solution. To turn that much power into speed, Beisel's team needed the largest propeller that had ever been fitted to a fighter aircraft, a blade spinning across a diameter of more than 13 feet. A propeller that size needed enormous ground clearance, which meant enormously long landing gear legs, which meant a fighter that would sit absurdly high and unstable on a pitching, rolling carrier deck. Long legs on a small ship in rough seas is an invitation to a broken aircraft. Beisel's answer was one of the strangest and most elegant shapes ever put on a production fighter aircraft. Instead of a straight wing, the Corsair's wing bent sharply downward close to the fuselage before angling back upward toward the tips, an inverted gull shape that let the landing gear legs stay short, while the wing root itself provided the ground clearance the enormous propeller needed. It looked awkward on paper and unmistakable in the air, and it solved a problem that a conventional wing simply could not. The prototype flew for the first time on the 29th of May 1940, and within months it had become the first American fighter aircraft ever to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. On paper, and in the open sky, it was already one of the finest fighters in the world. What nobody had fully tested yet was what would happen when a young pilot, exhausted and under pressure, tried to bring that same aircraft down onto the deck of a moving ship. The answer turned out to be almost nothing good. As production aircraft reached the fleet in 1942 and 1943, carrier qualification trials began to reveal a set of problems that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with survival. The long nose that housed that enormous engine blocked the pilot's forward view almost completely during a landing approach, forcing him to fly a curving, sideways glance at the deck rather than looking straight ahead the way every landing technique of the era assumed he would. Worse, the same torque from that enormous engine that gave the Corsair its speed made the left wing prone to stalling and dropping suddenly at the low speeds required for a carrier approach, with almost no warning before it happened. And the landing gear itself, engineered for a fast, hard aircraft, had a tendency to compress and then rebound sharply on touchdown, bouncing the aircraft back into the air at the exact moment a pilot believed he had landed safely, sending it porpoising unpredictably across the deck. Pilots died learning this. Aircraft were wrecked on decks that had barely enough room for a clean landing in the first place, and the losses mounted quickly enough that the aircraft earned a nickname among the men who flew it. They called it the Ensign Eliminator, a grim joke about the rank most often held by the newest and least experienced pilots being asked to bring this machine down onto a moving ship. It is worth sitting with that nickname for a moment. It was not a name given by an enemy. It was a name given by the Corsair's own side, describing what the aircraft was doing to them before it had fired a single shot at the Japanese. By the middle of 1943, the United States Navy reached a decision that must have felt, to the men who had designed this aircraft, like a repeat of a story they had heard before. The Corsair, faster and more powerful than almost anything else in the Pacific, was refused certification for carrier operations. It was, in the judgment of the service that had commissioned it, too dangerous to land on its own ships. If stories like this, engineers building something extraordinary only to watch the people in charge decide it cannot be trusted, are the kind of history that keeps you interested, this channel exists to keep telling them properly. Subscribing is free, it takes only a moment, and it is genuinely what helps stories like this one reach more people who would want to hear them. There is more of this coming. So the Corsair did not go to the carriers. Instead, it went to the jungle. Beginning in February of 1943, the aircraft was handed instead to United States Marine Corps squadrons operating from land-based airstrips in the Solomon Islands, starting with a unit designated Marine Fighting Squadron 124, flying out of the recently captured airfield on Guadalcanal. On land, the problems that had made the Corsair unmanageable on a carrier deck mattered far less. A long runway does not pitch and roll in the swell of the ocean. A pilot bringing the aircraft down onto solid ground had room to correct for a dropped wing or a bounce that would have ended in disaster aboard a ship. The airfields themselves were nothing like the smooth, paved runways the aircraft had been tested on back in the United States. Ground crews worked in tropical heat and constant humidity, maintaining an enormous and temperamental engine, using tools and spare parts that had to be shipped thousands of miles across an ocean still contested by the Japanese Navy. Mechanics who had never seen a Corsair before the war learned to keep the huge double wasp engine running through improvisation, because a broken fighter sitting useless on the ground did nothing to hold the line against Japanese air raids that could still appear over the island with little warning. The same engine that had made the aircraft too powerful for a gentle carrier landing was, on Guadalcanal, simply a machine that needed constant, exhausting care from men who rarely appear in any account of the aircraft's success at all. And once it was in the air over the Solomons, everything that had made the Corsair a liability on a carrier deck made it a nightmare for the pilots it was actually built to fight. The same enormous engine that had caused so much trouble at low speed gave it a rate of climb and a top speed that the Japanese Zero, the aircraft that had terrorized Allied pilots since the first days of the war in the Pacific, simply could not match above a few thousand feet. The Zero had been designed around lightness and maneuverability, sacrificing armor and structural strength for a turning circle that no Allied fighter could follow. The Corsair did not try to outturn it. It simply climbed above it, dove through it, and used raw speed and firepower to end the fight before the Zero's advantages could ever come into play. Marine squadrons flying the Corsair over the Solomon Islands and later over Rabaul began accumulating kill ratios that would have seemed like propaganda if they had not been independently verified. Units like the one commanded by Major Gregory Boyington, a former civilian mercenary pilot who had returned to military service, and would become one of the most decorated and most famous American fighter pilots of the entire war, flew the Corsair to results that quickly made Japanese pilots dread seeing that unmistakable bent-wing silhouette overhead. Boyington's squadron, a scratch unit assembled largely from pilots other squadrons had not wanted, flew missions over Rabaul that repeatedly put Corsairs directly over one of the most heavily defended Japanese air bases in the entire Pacific, and came home again and again with results that far outstripped anything the same pilots had managed in earlier, slower aircraft. American intelligence officers debriefing Japanese prisoners later in the war noted a consistent thread running through the interrogations. Zero pilots who had once dictated the terms of nearly every engagement in the Pacific described a new caution whenever the bent-winged silhouette of the Corsair appeared above them. The aircraft that could not safely land on its own country's carriers was, at the very same moment, teaching experienced Japanese fighter pilots to avoid a fight rather than seek one, a reversal that would have seemed almost impossible only a year earlier, when the Zero had still held the advantage in nearly every encounter across the Pacific. Across the war in the Pacific, the F4U Corsair would finish with one of the best kill ratios of any American fighter of the conflict, credited with roughly 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat. It is worth remembering that this figure was produced almost entirely by an aircraft the United States Navy itself had judged unfit for the one role it had originally been designed to fill. Pause on that, because here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells properly. The aircraft that was too dangerous to land on an American carrier was, at the exact same time, becoming one of the most feared fighters in the entire Pacific theater, flying from runways bulldozed out of jungle mud. The problem had never really been the aircraft. The problem had been asking it to do the one specific thing, a carrier landing, that its own design had made unusually difficult. Everywhere else, it was already a masterpiece. Now here is where the story needs a moment of honesty, because the reputation the Corsair earned in the Pacific was not quite as clean as the legend eventually became. Wartime kill claims, on every side of every theater of that war, were almost always inflated, and the Corsair's famous kill ratio is no exception. Pilots in the middle of a fast, chaotic engagement watching an enemy aircraft trail smoke and disappear into cloud or ocean far below often claimed a kill that post-war researchers, cross-checking squadron records against surviving Japanese unit histories, could not always confirm. Multiple pilots in the same engagement sometimes claimed the same falling aircraft independently, each certain he alone had made the kill. When historians after the war attempted to reconcile American claims with Japanese loss records, the ratio narrowed, though it never disappeared. The Corsair's advantage over the Zero was real, confirmed independently by both sides, but the 11-to-1 figure so often repeated sits closer to the upper end of a range that more careful post-war analysis places somewhat lower. Pause on that, because it matters. The point of saying this is not to diminish what Marine and Navy pilots achieved flying the Corsair. It is to notice that even a true story, a story about a genuinely superior aircraft overturning a genuinely superior reputation, gets exaggerated in the telling, and that the more interesting truth underneath the exaggeration is usually still remarkable enough on its own. The Corsair did not need an inflated number to be one of the most significant fighters of the Pacific War. It simply was one, and the honest figures still prove it. Which raises an obvious question. If the Corsair was this dangerous on a carrier deck, who actually solved that problem, and how did it get fixed? Here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the fix did not come from the country that built the aircraft. It came from the Royal Navy. Britain had begun receiving Corsairs through Lend-Lease in 1943, intended for use by the Fleet Air Arm aboard British aircraft carriers. The British inherited exactly the same problems the Americans had identified: the blind spot over the nose, the tendency to bounce, the sudden wing drop at low speed. But British carriers had a complication the Americans did not. Many of them had lower hangar deck ceilings than their American counterparts, and the Corsair's wings, even when folded, would not fit inside without modification. The fix that solved the clearance problem turned out, almost by accident, to help solve the handling problem as well. British ground crews clipped roughly 8 inches from each wingtip to make the folded aircraft fit below decks. That shortened wing subtly changed the aircraft's stall behavior at low speed, making the sudden wing drop that had killed American pilots noticeably less violent and more predictable. At the same time, British engineers modified the landing gear oleo struts to absorb the shock of touchdown more smoothly, reducing the bounce that had sent so many Corsairs porpoising across a deck. And British test pilots developed an entirely new landing technique to solve the visibility problem, a curving approach that kept the carrier deck in the pilot's sight the entire way down, instead of forcing him to look along a nose he could not see past. None of these were dramatic redesigns. They were small, practical, unglamorous fixes, the kind of solution that comes from mechanics and test pilots quietly solving a problem rather than engineers redrawing a blueprint from scratch. British test pilots also discovered something almost embarrassingly simple that American carrier doctrine had not yet tried, approaching the deck in a gentle curve rather than a straight line, keeping the ship visible out of the side of the cockpit for nearly the entire descent, instead of relying on a forward view that the Corsair's long nose had made almost useless. It cost nothing to teach. It required no new part, no factory modification, no redesign at all. It simply required someone to notice that the aircraft did not have to be flown the way every previous carrier fighter had been flown. And it worked. The Royal Navy qualified the Corsair for full carrier operations and began landing it successfully aboard British carriers before the United States Navy, the aircraft's own country of origin, had done the same with its own fleet. British Corsairs went on to fly from Royal Navy carriers in the Pacific and in strikes against targets as significant as the German battleship Tirpitz, proving in practice that the aircraft the Americans had grounded from their own decks could, with a handful of small changes, do exactly what it had been designed to do from the very beginning. Sit with that for a moment. The nation that built the aircraft was still refusing to trust it on a carrier deck, while a different nation was already landing it successfully at sea, using fixes that cost almost nothing and required no fundamental change to Rex Beisel's original design at all. It was only in late 1944, after adopting many of the same modifications the British had already proven, that the United States Navy finally certified the Corsair for its own carrier operations. By then, the aircraft had already spent close to 2 years fighting one of the most successful air campaigns of the Pacific War from runways that never moved beneath it at all. What actually went wrong, in the end, was never really a flaw in Rex Beisel's design. It was a mismatch between an aircraft built for raw performance and a set of carrier procedures written for gentler machines. The engine that made the Corsair dangerous to land was the same engine that made it nearly untouchable in the sky. The wing shape that complicated a slow approach was the same shape that let the aircraft carry that enormous propeller at all. Every problem the Corsair had on a carrier deck was the direct cost of every advantage it had in the air, and it took 2 years, one foreign navy, and a handful of small practical fixes for anyone to separate the two. Here is what is worth remembering. Rex Beisel never became as famous as some of the engineers of his era. He did not have a defining moment of public vindication the way a man like Roland Beaumont did when he refused to let the Typhoon be cancelled. Beisel simply kept working, quietly, while his aircraft was flying 2 very different lives at once, celebrated as a killer in the jungle skies over the Solomons and distrusted as a hazard on the very ships it had been designed to serve. Both of those things were true, and neither one fully explains the aircraft on its own. The Marine pilots who flew it in those early months over Guadalcanal were, on average, barely out of flight school, thrown into combat against an enemy that had already humiliated more experienced Allied pilots earlier in the war. They flew an aircraft their own navy did not yet trust enough to put on a carrier, against pilots the rest of the world still feared, and they won. Most of their names are not remembered outside of unit histories and after-action reports. The aircraft is remembered. The kill ratio is remembered. The men who flew it in those first uncertain months, when nobody yet knew whether the Corsair was a masterpiece or a mistake, mostly are not. By the time the war ended, the Chance Vought Corsair had been built in numbers exceeding 12,000 aircraft, and it remained in production and in frontline service, in one form or another, longer than almost any other piston-engine fighter of its generation. It flew in Korea nearly a decade after the fighting that made it famous had ended, still in frontline service long after most of its wartime contemporaries had been retired to museums and scrapyards. It became, eventually, exactly what its earliest specification had demanded back in 1938, the fastest and most capable carrier fighter of its time. It simply took longer than anyone expected, and it took a different Navy entirely to prove that the aircraft had never really been the problem at all. Consider how differently this story could have ended. If the United States Navy's early caution had hardened into permanent cancellation, if the Corsair had been quietly retired the way so many other troubled prototypes of that era were, the aircraft that ended up terrifying the Japanese fighter arm across the Solomons and Rabaul might simply never have reached a combat squadron at all. It survived not because someone in Washington had a change of heart, but because the United States Marine Corps needed fighters in the Pacific badly enough to accept an aircraft the Navy itself would not fly from its own ships, and because 2 years later a foreign navy solved, almost by accident, a problem that had nothing to do with the aircraft's fundamental design at all. Before closing, it is worth being honest about something, because that honesty is the whole point of telling a story like this properly. It would be easy to tell this as a simple tale of American stubbornness and British cleverness, but the reality is less tidy than that. The United States Navy's caution was not unreasonable. Pilots really were dying in carrier qualification accidents, and an institution responsible for the lives of thousands of young men was right to take that seriously, rather than rush a dangerous aircraft onto its decks before the problem was properly understood. It is also worth remembering that the United States Navy was, at the very same time, managing the qualification of several other new fighter types across a rapidly expanding carrier fleet, stretched across an ocean wide enough that solutions discovered on one side of the world did not always travel quickly to the other. The fixes that solved the Corsair's carrier problems look obvious only in hindsight. At the time, nobody was certain that clipping a few inches off a wingtip or changing a single landing technique would be enough, and it took real trial and error on both sides of the Atlantic to find out that it was. The Corsair's story is not a simple story about one country getting it wrong and another getting it right. It is a story about how long it can take, even with everyone acting in good faith and under real pressure, to fully understand a genuinely new kind of machine. Rex Beisel kept designing naval aircraft after the Corsair, and the shape he gave it, that unmistakable bent wing, remained in the air over 3 separate wars before the last Corsair was finally retired from frontline service. The aircraft that had once been called too dangerous to land became, in the end, simply one of the finest fighters ever built, exactly as its own specification had demanded from the very beginning. It just needed the rest of the world to catch up to what Rex Beisel had already built. If you have made it this far, this channel exists to keep telling stories exactly like this one, about the engineers whose names rarely make it into the history books, and the aircraft that had to prove themselves twice before anyone believed in them. Subscribing is free, it takes only a few seconds, and it genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who would want to hear them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.